We are joined today by Dr. Gary Coupland, who is a Professor Emeritus of Anthropology at University of Toronto, where he taught and supervised multiple generations of archaeologists, starting in 1988 until his retirement in 2022. Gary's academic legacy spans the country, and former graduate students, myself among them, are now in faculty positions themselves, some with their own academic legacies. His dudeliness has a BA in Archaeology from University of Toronto, an MA in Anthropology from Trent University, where he studied Andean hill forts, and his PhD in Anthropology from UBC. Gary is the former president of the Canadian Archaeological Association, the former editor of the Canadian Journal of Archaeology. He's published 4 books, including the book on the prehistory of the Northwest Coast with R.G. Matson. He's published dozens of peer-reviewed publications, and has decades of research on 2 major projects, the Shishelt Archaeology Project, based out of Shishelt Traditional Territory northwest of Vancouver, and the Northwest Coast Housing Project, based out of Prince Rupert Harbor. This work makes Gary a specialist in Northwest Coast archaeology, specifically the development of inequality, hierarchy, and trans-egalitarian societies in that region, and a guru of household archaeology. He's joining us today from the East End in Toronto to talk about these topics, and welcome to the podcast, Gary.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for joining us, Gary. I'm excited to talk about Andean hill forts for the next half hour. But we're a podcast that's primarily aimed at an East Coast audience. I mean, although we're of course continental in scale. But before we get going, could you give us just an overview of what people mean when they talk about the Northwest Coast, what it represents, the cultural geography, and why it's such an important and well-known region in the archaeology of North America?
Okay. The Northwest Coast basically refers to the long strip, north to south strip of Pacific coastline of North America. From north to south, it includes, generally taken to include the Alaska Panhandle, southeastern Alaska, what's commonly called the Panhandle, the entire coast of British Columbia, the entire coast of Washington State, Oregon State, and maybe even at the very, very far northern coast of California. So geographically, that's the location. It mainly refers to the coastal areas of that long strip, although the Northwest Coast also includes a number of rivers that come out of the mountains. It's a very, very rugged region topographically with coastal mountains, especially in BC and southeastern Alaska. A number of rivers cut through those mountains. Northwest Coast culture is taken to include groups that lived along the lower courses of those rivers, either permanently or seasonally. What else can I say? The northern coastline in particular, again, Southeast Alaska, BC, is very, very rugged because it's so mountainous. So it's a true fjord coastline, lots of long, deep inlets, which kind of maximizes the extent of the coastline because it's not one long straight coastline. Farther south, the outer Washington coast, the Oregon coast tend to be more straighter coastlines. And that may have had some cultural implications in the past as well. But I think the last key point that I want to make is that, and you asked about the cultural relevance of the Northwest Coast. Well, of course, it's the region of the potlatch, which I think every introductory anthropology student in university learns about. It's also the region of what some have come to call complex hunter-gatherers. I know we're going to get into more of a discussion of that as we go along. And it's a region of fast-flowing rivers that empty into these inlets and along the coastline. the Fraser River, the Columbia River, farther north where I worked, the Skeena River, and many smaller rivers in between, almost all of which get major salmon runs, major annual runs of Pacific salmon, which became the main, not only, but the main food source for people living along that coast and in the region for the past 10,000 years, and probably was a main resource driver of this complexity that we're going to go on and take a look at a little bit later. So,
yeah, that's right. And so you mentioned so the intro to anthropology, potlatch, and tying in with complex hunter-gatherers. And so that term's used to describe some of the Northwest Coast groups. And can you give us sort of a rundown of what we are talking about when we're saying complex hunter-gatherers, and when and where that category is applied, basically what it looks like archaeologically?
Sure. Well, I think it's probably useful to take that term complex hunter-gatherers and divide it into two parts, the complex part and the hunter-gatherer part. By hunter-gatherers, we mean people who hunted, who fished, and who foraged for their food with little or no reliance on domesticates. So they didn't grow corn, they didn't grow rice, they didn't have domesticated animal herds. Complex is a more loaded term that I think we'll get into more of a discussion here. Complex in the sense of complex societies. Now, I think when anthropologists probably a century ago or more coined that term, wherever it came from, complex societies, what were they referring to? I think they were referring to societies from the middle, I'll say, of the last 5,000 years, mainly in the Middle East, the Near East, perhaps to a certain extent in the Far East, and a little bit later on in Mesoamerica and maybe Andean South America and maybe a few other regions of the world too. Societies that had urbanism, people lived in cities. Societies that had a state level of political organization. And the catch term, I think, for that, urbanism and the state, was societies with civilization, right? But civilization is a loaded term. What do you mean by civilization? Who's not civilized, right? Who gets to be civilized and who's not civilized?
Ken, that's a rhetorical question. Don't answer that, Ken.
Yeah. Well,
we're about to get real political here. That's
we're getting real political. So we'll just leave that hanging for a second and move to the term hunter-gatherer. I mean, complexity is defined by a few other traits as well. High population density, as you would expect with urbanism and maybe with the state. Specialized production, where we got it here. Sedentism, as you would expect with urbanism. Large-scale storage. These are, so complex societies, complexity becomes, in that sense, a kind of a trait list of things. And you are complex or not complex to the degree that your culture includes any number of these traits.
Yeah, and there's sort of that, is it Ken Sassaman has a paper where there's sort of this ticky box. The traditional approach has been this kind of checklist of all of these traits.
The trait list approach, which is, is problematic in a number of ways. And I think one more trait that ties complexity and hunter-gatherers together, maybe in a sort of negative way, is that it was always assumed that complexity, one of the key traits of complexity, was agriculture, large-scale food production. And you couldn't be civilized. You couldn't have civilization without agriculture. So that left hunter-gatherers out. Now, I think what we see on the Northwest coast is that some of those tick boxes of traits that you're talking about, Ken, do seem to apply. Maybe even limited cultivation. There are a few examples. But without fully developed agriculture anywhere on the Northwest coast traditionally. So, can you be complex in the absence of agriculture? Can you be a complex hunter-gatherer? I have colleagues, when I started at University of Toronto, one of the famous anthropologists there was Richard Lee, who simply took the term complex hunter-gatherers to be an oxymoron. Can't be, cannot be. But nevertheless, on the West Coast, you had people who potlatched, produced great amounts of wealth, who revered status differences among families and among individuals, had a lot of inequality, hereditary inequality, but by and large did not farm, except with a few exceptions that we can go on to talk about.
Yeah, and is that referring to...
So maybe it's not an oxymoron after all. And there are, of course, around the world, some other examples that we could point to as well.
And so a lot of your work, Gary, is focused really on the inequality aspect of complexity among hunter-gatherers.
Right. And I mean, early in my career, I guess I was happy enough to use the term complexity and talk about complex hunter-gatherers. Some literature came along, maybe beginning about 20 years ago, or maybe even a little more. Randall McGuire, Madonna Moss on the West Coast, a few others who were questioning and critiquing the use of the term complexity and saying, this is a term we really, it's vague. It's a term we link with a kind of a progressive evolutionary model that is kind of 19th century in origin. And along that vein, I began thinking about that, and I began, taking note of that critique. And along that vein, I would add, it's also complexity is largely a colonial concept that has probably very little meaning in the sense that we use it, cultural complexity. Complex societies probably has very little meaning or relevance to indigenous Northwest Coast groups, and certainly not to their ancestors hundreds and thousands of years ago. So it's a term that very much needs to be unpacked. And as I thought more and more about that, I began to think, what I'm really interested in is not urbanism and agriculture and so on. What I'm really interested in is the inequality, the forms of inequality that are usually associated with complexity, and how these forms of inequality are represented on the Northwest Coast. And so I began to kind of parse it and narrow down my interests from complexity in the large, vague, amorphous sense to something that you could, I think, define more clearly and just get your hands on and work with more clearly.
Yeah. When you talk about inequality, what sort of what do you mean by inequality?
The term I used in one of the papers we had that I guess we're going to talk a little bit about, in which very large numbers of beads were recovered in burial context, mortuary context. The term we were using is material wealth-based inequality. for it to be archaeologically useful and usable, I think that materiality has to be involved there somewhere.
Right.
Or, how do we approach it as archaeologists? So the materiality in this example were the hundreds of thousands of beads, stone beads that we recovered. Material wealth-based inequality. We argued that those beads, which were mortuary offerings, but also recovered in some other contexts as well, not just in burials, were a form of wealth, that those beads represented wealth. And a kind of fungible wealth in the sense that you take one bead, you take another bead, you take hundreds of thousands of beads, they all look pretty much alike, right? And they can be assumed, or I assume, each bead pretty much has the same value. Being careful to note that the history of each of these beads, who owned these beads or those beads previous to their internment, could also add to or subtract from their value. So their history it is not irrelevant, is important, but it really looked to me like you've seen one bead, you've seen them all. They're like pennies.
That's how I feel about rocks, actually, Ken.
Yeah. They're like stone pennies, and each with roughly the same value. So could that be treated as wealth? And I thought that it could. And so, you can examine inequality from the standpoint of material wealth differences. Why is it that some of these contexts, whether the beads are recovered from a burial or from a house floor or whatever their context, why do we find tens of thousands and even hundreds of thousands in some contexts, but only a handful in other contexts? Is that a material representation of inequality? Depends obviously on the contexts, but can we investigate inequality from that standpoint? And I thought we could, and so
yeah. And for the listener, the big difference here is that traditionally in hunting and gathering societies, we tend to view hunter-gatherers as egalitarian, right? That everybody kind of has the same access to food and to other the needs of life and subsistence. And whereas in these complex hunter-gatherer situations or these unequal situations on the Northwest coast, what you're seeing is changes within particular houses, like actual structures. Yeah. Some are bigger, some are smaller, but then even within those houses, some people seem to have more things than other people.
Exactly. And I think a good way to put it is, you raised the point, Ken, is, my old colleague Richard Lee, who I love dearly and highly respect, would say that among egalitarian hunter-gatherers, and Richard would and aren't they all, what matters most is sharing. What I have is yours if you need it. What you have is mine if I need it. We live, we survive, we do well or we don't do well on the basis of sharing and how well we share what we've got. On the Northwest coast, A.L. Kroeber, famous anthropologist from a century ago, wrote, "What seems to matter most to these people is possession." And he went through a long list of things that could be possessed, not just material wealth, but oral history, family crests, all kinds, songs, stories that can be only told by a certain person. What mattered most was possession. Well, that's a long way from what matters most is sharing. In fact, I think some would say that's almost oppositional. And so what interested me was, how did this emphasis on possession come about? And it's, where, did many societies in their past go through this kind of moment where an emphasis on sharing suddenly began to change to an emphasis on possession? What are the conditions under which that happens? Or in all societies going way back into prehistory, can we say, well, there were moments when sharing was emphasized, and then there are moments when possession might be emphasized? And it's not a replacement of one by the other, but it could be a kind of back and forth, almost cyclical relationship between the two as living conditions and other sorts of things, social conditions, change.
And so on the Northwest coast, about how long ago and what were kind of the factors that drove, like when did this sort of appearance of inequality begin? And was there something was there a driving event? Was there a particular, was it all salmon all the time or a variety of different things? We don't, it's not easy to point to one.
Well, smoked, some of it's wind dried, as long as it's salmon, that's the key.
It was not all salmon all the time, and I would have a number of Northwest Coast archaeological colleagues who would really get on my case if I said it was all about salmon and nothing else. There were...
The listener doesn't realize I've got some of Gary's old slides, and one of the terms that's on there is to be wary of salmonopia. Is the when thinking about the Northwest Coast,
which credit where credit's due, was actually a term that I think Greg Monks, now retired from University of Manitoba, very good West Coast archaeologist, he coined the term salmonopia, inability to see the other resources for the salmon.
Okay.
There's an old saying on the West Coast, when the tide rolls out, the table is set, and they're talking about shellfish and all the intertidal resources that are suddenly available for a 5 or 6 hour period until the tide rolls back in again. And sea mammals and all kinds of other fish, not just salmon. What was critical there, and I think what underpinned inequality, complexity, whatever you want to call it, on the Northwest Coast, was in lieu of agriculture, in the absence of highly developed agriculture, was a natural resource base, a wild resource base that was incredibly bountiful, with a number of seasonal resources that could be caught taken in very large numbers, salmon, again, being a very good example, but not the only one, taken in very large amounts when available, when they run in the rivers, and that's usually from midsummer on into the autumn, the fall. And then they can be readily preserved for storage, either through smoking or wind drying, which Gabe mentioned, and preserved for storage and made to last through the lean season in the winter and carry people right on into the spring and early summer of the following year. The general consensus is availability of food was never a problem. There was more than enough that you could eat at any given time. And so you could take as much as you wanted or needed, some to be preserved for future use, for future consumption, but also some that could be transformed through trade and exchange into other forms of wealth. Those stored food resources themselves could have been seen as a form of wealth. And certainly trading dried fish for beads or other kinds of material wealth was a possibility, was certainly definitely done. So a natural food base, a wild food base that could underpin complexity in much the same way that agriculture underpinned complexity in other parts of the world. And if you look at regions around the world where we have other examples of complex hunter-gatherers, like coastal Southern California, Scandinavia, coastal Scandinavia, the Mesolithic of coastal the far north in Europe, the Near Eastern Natufian, you're looking again at areas where certain wild food resources were bountiful enough that they could support not just subsistence, but the surplus production of the production of surplus above and beyond subsistence. That surplus could be transformed into wealth, and that wealth becomes the basis for inequality. I mean, it's not surprising that where you have fjord coastlines in the world, if you go back far enough in time, you probably have pretty good examples of complex hunter-gatherers. And the Northwest Coast is just one of those regions.
That's interesting.
And so, Gary, you've had two major long-term projects that have dug into these topics, and they've been located in different parts of the BC coast, and at Seychelles and at Prince Rupert. And so how do those places differ? And in terms of the archaeology, how related or not are the groups that are in each of those places?
Okay. I mean, I started after I finished my PhD, which was also in northern BC, but not coastal. It was on the Skeena River at a location called Kitsalis Canyon. And then after I finished that, I began a project. You mentioned the Northwest Coast Housing Project at Prince Rupert. And the main reason I shifted to Prince Rupert, which was maybe just 150 kilometers down the Skeena River to the coast at Prince Rupert. The main reason that I made that shift was because in coastal contexts, like Prince Rupert, the sites are usually defined as shell midden sites, where there are large deposits of shell. That shell, I know this is going to be one of your next questions, so I'm jumping the gun here, but that shell, mussel shell, clam shells, etc., that are deposited in these large mounds and middens, which are literally garbage dumps, enhance preservation in soil conditions that would otherwise be very acidic and would have very poor preservation. So you get very good organic preservation in shell. And I thought the one thing that I was missing at Kitsalis that I would be able to get at farther down at the coast, and Prince Rupert was the nearest coastal location. The one thing I would be able to get would be lots and lots of fish bones and deer bones and bones from all other animals
but mostly salmon.
Well, that's what I wanted to see. That's what we assumed was the case at Kitsalis, because it was on the Skeena River. It was a canyon. It was the first, as you go upriver from the coast, which is what salmon do when they migrate. It was the first constriction on the river where there was, canyon conditions with rapids, a critical salmon fishing location. Village sites, archaeological sites with evidence of permanent houses were right there. So we knew that people were living in villages there, and I assumed they're living in villages here because the salmon fishing is so good. But I can't test that idea because we don't get very good bone preservation,
right?
Because there are no shell middens when you're 150 kilometers up the river. So we started a project at Prince Rupert, and where there was good bone preservation in the shell middens. And not surprisingly, we found tons and tons of salmon bone. And by far and away, salmon was the most common faunal animal resource in these middens compared to everything else combined. And So they were really salmon specialists, along with some shell food to balance out the diet. And a little bit of deer bone, but very little. And very, very little of other fish.
You have any recipe suggestions for the listener?
Well, I like it. I like salmon plank smoked on a cedar.
Yeah, that is good.
Good.
Maple syrup on top.
Be careful to soak the plank for a good 2 hours that it smokes and doesn't burn up on your barbecue grill.
Okay.
Yeah. And so what we also found at Prince Rupert was were sites, many sites that had evidence of permanent villages. These were clearly village sites, a couple of 3,000 years old, some more, even older. And we knew they were villages because of the deep shell middens at the back of the site, farthest from the shoreline. And in between the shoreline and the big deep shell middens were evidence on the surface of the ground of what were clearly house floors.
It's like big depressions, basically. Eh? Big depressions, yeah.
Yeah, what we would call house depressions. And these were long and narrow, rectangular in shape, sites with 10 or 8, 9, 10 house depressions, other sites with 25, 30 house depression features. Often houses arranged side by side in rows, often with 2 rows or even 3 rows of houses as you proceed from the shoreline up the bank and farther back towards the big deep shell midden. And these house features, they gave us tremendous opportunity to record a lot of different things without even much excavation, which was always very good. We could record the size of the house depressions and get a very good idea of the size of the houses that once stood on these spots. And we began to recognize that in some of these villages, the houses were about 50, 60 square meters in size, maybe an extended family or maybe 2 related families living in them, 8, 10 people, maybe a dozen, but probably not more than that. And then there were a couple of house depressions in the site that were quite a bit larger than all of the others. So the question became, A, were these bigger houses clearly residential houses that people lived in, or did they have another purpose, ceremonial, ritual perhaps? And B, if they are residential, who lived in these houses? Why are they so much bigger? Could these have been houses owned and occupied by high status chiefs? 1,500, 2,000 years ago. And so that required some excavation and fairly large scale excavation. And we would try to limit it's very time consuming. We'd try to limit the excavation to do as little destruction of the site as possible, but we're still after certain kinds of data. Are there more wealth items coming from these larger houses? What about the food remains in these larger houses? Are they the same? Is there more salmon? Is there less salmon than in the smaller houses? So with that kind of strategy and with those kinds of sites, you could start to do some comparisons and look for evidence of inequality. A point that just went through my mind about 10 minutes ago, but I come back to it now. I don't like excavating burials. And at Sechelt, we were asked by the Sechelt Nation to excavate some burials at a site called Quentin Macaulay. You asked me to compare Prince Rupert to farther south, so I'm getting to that now. We never excavated any burials in Prince Rupert in 15 years of field research there. We certainly came across human burials and human remains. As soon as we did, we stopped excavating, stopped digging, reported it to the relevant First Nations, and stopped excavation. What do you want us to do with this? Yeah, we would like you to not excavate any of the burials of our ancestors. And we stopped. At Seashell, we had a different context, which I'll remind me to get back to this in a minute. But by and large, I have never wanted to excavate burials. Just don't want to do it. You know, they said, you're digging up somebody's ancestors. How would you like it if they did that to your ancestors? All of that. So, but it's well known amongst archaeologists, if you want to look for inequality, and in particular material wealth-based inequality, you're most likely to find it in the grave offerings, in burials. And you're most likely going to be able to see the difference between a powerful chief, high-status chief, based on that person's grave offerings, and someone else who was of much lower status based on their grave offerings. You're going to find a lot more wealth in the chief's grave. So is there a way that we can investigate inequality without disturbing burials? And I thought a good way to do that would be to look at house features. And instead of comparing wealth and other goods from burials, we'd be comparing whatever we recovered from a number of different excavated house features. Big houses, small houses, houses in between. And see if some of these ideas about the size of a house, the number of people who lived in a house, who provided labor and fishing and so on for that household, correlated with, different forms of wealth, different amounts of wealth, number of beads.
Amount of salmon.
Yeah.
Nephrite adzes.
Amount of salmon for sure. Different type. Who had more sockeye? Who had more, coho salmon, and who had other types that may not have been as greatly valued.
So did just to interrupt for a second here on the salmon thing. So, like Brian Hayden has that kind of famous example of different types of salmon in different houses up in the plateau. And do you see the same kind of patterning in some of these bigger houses, that there's different varieties or older, larger salmon in the bigger houses? Is that?
Yeah, we did. I think what we found is that in the larger houses, and Hayden and his project at Keatley Creek, and Anna Prentice, who worked at Keatley Creek and some other locations nearby in the Middle Fraser, they got a lot more extensively into identification of different salmon species, from the vertebrate remains that were recovered, the bone remains that were of salmon that were recovered, from DNA studies and so on. They got a lot more into that than we were ever able to do. But it seemed pretty clear in some of the house features that we excavated in Prince Rupert that there was evidence of 3 or 4 different species of salmon remains recovered from that house, which happened to be one of the bigger houses. And from the smaller houses, not 100% certain of this, but it did look like there was less variety of salmon, more exclusively focused on the remains of maybe pink salmon or chum or something like that. And so, what do you make of that? If, people in one house have a greater variety, there are 5 or 6 different species of Pacific salmon. If you find the remains of 4 or 5 of those species in one house, but only 1 or 2 species in the other, what do you make of that? I would say there's an economic difference there, and probably a social difference as well. So, what I was getting to there is that I think excavating house features, doing household archaeology, provides, in this sense, a good alternative, and certainly a preferable alternative to doing mortuary archaeology. We can get at some of those same questions about inequality and economic and social differences through household archaeology. And also, we get at something, I think, that's very, very different from the mortuary concept. Burials are ritual and ceremonial, and they don't happen all the time. So the archaeology of mortuary context is an archaeology of ritual and ceremony. The archaeology of houses that people lived in is an archaeology of everyday life, the quotidian. And I think that allows you to ask a whole series of different questions about understanding society and economics in the past that you would never get you'd never be able to ask those questions out of mortuary context if you did excavate them. And I should point out that at Shishal, we had a site, Quentin McQualley, in which I thought was a village site, and I thought we might be able to do the kind of household archaeology that we had done in Prince Rupert in my previous project, that we could continue the Northwest Coast housing project in the Shishal territory. And frankly, I have to admit that one of the main reasons for the switch from Prince Rupert after 15 years to 10 or 12 years of research in the Shishal territory is that the Shishal territory is referred to by most people in British Columbia as the Sunshine Coast.
The listener can't see Gary's shirt right now, but you can tell he's a man who likes sunshine. That's
well, yeah. You get, and Prince Rupert is famous for its level of precipitation, staggering amount of rain. So I was ready to move to a drier location, but I wanted to continue doing household archaeology, and I thought we had a good opportunity for that in the Shishal region. Spoke with representatives of the Shishal Nation. They seemed to be enthusiastic and receptive to the idea, and we thought we had a really good site with a deep midland, was somewhat disturbed in the last 50 years or so, but not terribly. We thought there were areas that were undisturbed where we might find house features. And one summer before I got to the field, I had a couple of graduate students who were out looking at the site and doing some preliminary testing to see where might we find house features and house floors and do household archaeology. And I got a call from one of my students who said, you know what, we've got an eroding cut bank here, and there are beads, lots and lots of stone beads that just seem to be falling out of this cut bank. So this eroding cut bank is some recent disturbance. It's obviously cut into an older feature, archaeological feature, cultural feature. And the feature contains a lot of stone beads, which are now falling out of this cut bank slope. And my first thought was, oh no, you guys have found probably the remains of a burial. So I said, first of all, stop working on it. Let's report this to the Shishal Nation and see where we go from there. And so we did. And the long story short, the Shishal Nation and the province of British Columbia were sort of in competition for this particular site location, which the Seychelles Nation wanted control of, but province of British Columbia, for various reasons, but the province of British Columbia was saying, no, this is Crown land. This is not on any of your designated reserves. Seychelles people were saying, well, it should be a reserve. They were at a bit of an impasse. And the elected chief of the nation said to me, I said, I think these are burials that we found. I think we found maybe 2 different burials that have been cut through by previous non-archaeological work at the site. What do you want us to do? And if they are burials, can you prove that? Well, we can investigate. We might find human remains that would pretty much prove it, but these would be ancestors, the remains of ancestors. He said, let me talk to elders and so on. There was a long discussion. We hadn't started field work. I was wondering, are we going to have any field work? He got back to me and said, we would like you to proceed with the excavation of these burials. Because we think this will provide powerful evidence that this is an important, very important traditional site to our people, and we can, show this evidence to the province. And so, on that basis, we did, and I think it ended up being an example of collaborative archaeology with a BC First Nation group. An example of collaborative archaeology, mortuary archaeology, that I think I ended up feeling good about doing this excavation when, for years before that, I don't want to excavate burials. I don't want to touch burials. But under these circumstances, under these conditions, I think, yeah, this is something if I would feel good about going ahead and doing this if this is what you want me to do. And so we did. We found hundreds of thousands of beads, clearly in burial context, with human remains, other evidence of wealth. And what was very interesting was that when we radiocarbon dated these burial features, the dates came back at about 4,000 years old. Up to that point, the theory, the model that I had been working on, and I think many other, but not all, Northwest Coast archaeologists, was that inequality, complexity, if you want, was much more recent than that, by at least a couple of thousand years. So here we had evidence of incredibly wealthy burials, huge amount of material wealth in the form of these beads, about at least 1,500 years older than what we thought would have been the beginnings of that kind of complexity. So that made me, Ken made reference to the book that R.G. Matson and I had written 30 years ago, and we pushed the idea that complexity came about 2,000, 2,500 years ago to the Northwest Coast, not 4,000 years. That's way too early. Now here was evidence that I think we were wrong. And not only were we wrong about the origins of complexity, it made me begin to think, are we thinking the right way about complexity and inequality? Is it something that finally comes along, and then once it's there, there's no going back? Is it a progressive evolutionary development, kind of old 19th century thinking, but hard to escape sometimes? Or should we be thinking about this inequality as something that emerges at certain times and in certain places on the Northwest Coast, as well as in other regions, and maybe lasts for a number of generations, maybe a few centuries or even more? enough to leave an archaeological record. But then for some reason, whatever the conditions change, and that inequality is a little bit later on is not emphasized so much.
So it's lessened in
rises and falls rather than this progressive march ever onward, ever upward towards, civilization.
It's not just complex, it's complicated.
Complex, and it's got to be that. Yeah. So I think that was a rambling answer to about 3 or 4.
No, that's perfect. And for the listener too, if you've been to the Canadian Museum of History, I believe that if it's still there, maybe Gabe, you've been there more recently than I have, but one time there was an exhibit that those ancestors from Shishelt are part of an exhibit that they did some digital reconstruction of the family or the individuals that were found at those burials. So
they were able to use the human remains, do facial reconstruction, and if those burial remains do represent a single family, what exactly do we mean by family? But certainly represented the remains of a group of people who lived together and who lived at this particular site, this particular location, 3,800, 4,000 years ago. So yeah, that was a pretty interesting development that came out of it too. So I think some very good archaeological work was done there, and in collaboration with and in the service of First Nations groups these were their ancestors. This is their territory, and these were their ancestors. So it was a unique, I don't know, very rare and unusual opportunity.
Yeah.
And yeah, I guess I was in the right place at the right time.
Well, Gary, thanks for joining us to talk about these topics. We appreciate you coming on and sharing some of the information from the other coast.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Featuring Gabe Reinick and Ken Holyoke. The New Brunswick Archaeology Podcast.